Welcome to NIEM IEPDs, part 1 of 3. In this section, we have an introduction to IEPDs, what in the world they are. We're going to talk about scenario planning, requirement analysis, and modeling of an exchange. So let's start out with the obvious question, what is an IEPD? Well, IEPD stands for Information Exchange Package Documentation. Nice name, huh? The name itself actually comes from some federal architecture stuff, so it's not entirely the NIEM's fault that the name is so awful. But what an IEPD is a collection of artifacts, a collection of information used to document an information exchange. You have two parties and they're going to exchange information, and the definition for what that exchange is going to contain is all documented in the IEPD. The IEPD acts as a guide to implementation, so it's something people can take to see what they need to do to implement a particular exchange. It talks about all the things that go into the exchange itself, so it's a guide to implementation. It increases comprehension of the exchange. In other words, people can, look at the exchange XML and get an idea, but the IEPD provides additional information so that people really know what the exchange is all about. It also helps ensure reusability of the exchange in the future. In case somebody wants to develop a similar exchange, they can look at an earlier one, the IEPD for an earlier one, and see what it was all about and see what they might have to do. Or if the same agency with this IEPD wants to make a new one in the future, they want to revise and improve the exchange, again, having an IEPD, having all this documentation that describes what the exchange is about is very helpful when you want to do more with it in the future. So what actually goes into an IEPD? Well, an IEPD is really just a collection of documents. Now, those documents come in two types. Some of the documents are designed for human consumption. Things like textual documents, that would be kind of general documentation, maybe memorandum of understanding, other kinds of things like that. Maybe statutes that are involved that allow you to do a certain exchange, things like that. UML diagrams for modeling what the exchange looks like, and we're going to deal with that later in this presentation. Spreadsheets that say which things in my model map to which things in the NIEM, and that's for section 2. We're going to talk about that in detail. So there's a lot of documents that are for people to look at. Then there are documents for computers to consume, and that would be schemas themselves, and there's a whole nother presentation about the various schemas that go into an IEPD. Instance documents that validate against the schemas that define the exchange, style sheets to make those instance documents look pretty. So there's a lot of different documents that are there for computer use as well. Some of these documents are required, and some of them are optional, and some of them are technically optional, but in the real world are almost always there. If you want to know all the different artifacts, all the different kinds of documents that can go into an IEPD, and which ones are required and which ones are optional, there's an IEPD specification on NIEM.gov that lists them all, and it's a fairly lengthy list of the kind of things you can put in an IEPD. But also an important point is that it's not a limiting list. If you can think of some piece of documentation that ought to go in an IEPD that helps describe an exchange you're working on more fully than what's listed in the IEPD specification, by all means include it in the IEPD. There isn't anything that says, nope, you can't put this in an IEPD. If it helps people understand what the exchange is about and helps people implement the exchange, then it belongs in an IEPD. There's a life cycle involved in creating an IEPD, and this diagram shows it. This life cycle defines both the development process for making an IEPD as well as the recommended artifacts at each stage. It starts at the top with scenario planning. That leads into analyzing requirements, which leads to mapping and modeling, which leads to building and validating, leading to assembling and documenting, and then finally publishing and implementing. But I say finally, and I don't really mean finally, because you see, publish and implement leads right back into scenario planning. What that means is that the results from one IEPD feed into the scenario planning for other IEPDs. One of the steps in planning an IEPD is to look at previous IEPDs that people have done in the same area and be able to use those as a starting point. So IEPDs feed into other IEPDs, maybe an IEPD done by a different agency, maybe the same IEPD done at a later time to enhance an exchange. Let's talk a little about each step in the IEPD lifecycle. Scenario planning is planning the project, establishing the process, and identifying information exchange business requirements. That sounds simple, but there's a lot that goes into it. Stage 2, analyzing requirements, means taking that exchange that we've just started planning, that we have a scenario for, and figuring out what the actual requirements are for it. What pieces of information are going to need to be exchanged. Step 3, mapping and modeling, means associating your local objects that are part of your exchange with types and elements that are in the NIEM. Basically, you're looking at the NIEM and seeing which pieces of the NIEM are going to work in your exchange. You don't want the whole NIEM, you want pieces of it, and here's where you decide which pieces you're going to use. Also, part of this process is finding out which pieces of your exchange are not in the NIEM, things that you need to extend the NIEM for in order to meet the entire needs and requirements of your exchange. Building and validating means actually creating the schemas that create the payload for your exchange. Both schemas out of the NIEM as well as extension and exchange schemas that you build yourself. Now, more information about these schemas are in other presentations. Step 5 is assembling and documenting. That means taking all the different pieces and putting them together. Taking all the schemas you created in the previous step and packaging them together with the human-oriented artifacts, which mainly come out of the scenario planning stage. And then the last one is publish and implement. And it's kind of the hardest one in a lot of ways, but it's also the one we're going to talk about the least in these materials. Publishing basically means putting them out there in repositories so that they're available for search, discovery, and reuse by others. Implementation is a huge beast that we don't even cover in these training materials because, frankly, it's so situationally dependent that there's just very little that we can tell you about it.